As we know now, the Beatles were a cultural tidal wave, and they swept every other form of music off the radio.
You know, I think I came of age in the early 60s, and that's when the Beatles were ruling the airwaves. I heard somebody describe them as a cute little boy band that had a couple of good songs. Well, they were way beyond that.
So the Beatles' revolution began with their triumphant explosion in North America in 1964. At the time, you could have been forgiven for wondering if it was marketing or talent.
What got me most about the Beatles wasn't the look, wasn't the whole... I mean, they were kind of like, when you figure when they first came out, they were like a boy band. Or, you know what I mean? Like a, you know, She Loves You, yeah, and girls, screaming girls. But then, you know, I really loved just their hooks. I was sitting there going, I can't believe I'm singing like 10 of their tunes right now. So I think somewhere in there, even though I wasn't songwriting yet, somewhere in there, their songwriting was having an influence on me. That's exactly how they were presented to the world. Little ties, little haircuts, and screaming girls running after them. What were the Backstreet Boys? What were New Kids on the Block? It was exactly the same thing. Difference was the Beatles had something creative going on that they could, then their producer who went, okay, we're gonna now live in the studio and do some serious damage. I got to record at Abbey Road, actually. We had to record a song called Paradise Skies because they wanted British Masters for a show called Top of the Pops, which Hendrix played on, everybody played on that show. And so they said, we've been calling around recording studios. The only one we can get into tonight is Abbey Road. You guys okay with that? And we're like, if that's all that's gonna, yeah, it'll do. So we went there. But what was really funny was, immediately as soon as the drums came, I was like, boom, boom. It sounded like Ringo. It's sort of compressed. We're like, it sounds like Ringo's drums in here. And meanwhile, it was a completely different kit, different engineer, but there was some kind of, and I remember standing there kind of getting chills going, this is where all of it took place, right here, standing around the piano, that piano right there. And we, you know, rolled out of there at 6 in the morning after drinking a case of wine and had to walk across the road. And you could tell the neighbors, they could hear the bottles, and neighbors like looking out their windows, oh no, it's another rock band crossing the road like the Beatles did. Probably a daily happening, right?
Juno Award-winning guitarist Keith Glass is probably best known for his work with Canadian country band Prairie Oyster. The Beatles opened his teenage eyes to what could be accomplished by a musical group.
You know, I think I came of age in the early 60s, and that's when the Beatles were ruling the airwaves. I heard somebody describe them as a cute little boy band that had a couple of good songs. Well, they were way beyond that. But arguably one of the first acts to be marketed like that, and certainly one of the first bands to be really marketed like, okay, you can have a band, you can be in a band, and it's cool to be in a band. You don't have to be Elvis Presley, you don't have to be the singer guy. You can be in a band. So there's a role for everybody. All of a sudden, the parameters widened up. I think a lot of people would say that, would maybe agree with me on that it was the band thing that was appealing. Plus it was cool, and they looked cool, and they sounded cool, and gosh, they were cute as heck, so, you know, girls loved them. Nothing wrong with that. So, yeah, the Beatles were, I think, the big eye-opener, ear-opener, mind-opener for me.
It's 1964, and the tsunami is about to hit.
We were playing a variety of music. In those days, you know, cha-chas were in, just prior to the Beatles. After that, everything was out.
The gig that changed a life, filmed by a proud father. Never before seen footage of the Beatles and the beginning of a new era in music. I've heard hardcore guitarists say they'd travel to the ends of the earth for that certain special guitar. Nick Angelo is making sure they'll have to make the trip if they want any of his guitars. His guitar store is located in the bucolic countryside near Bethany, Ontario. You've heard of Bethany, right?
I'm in a small town in the middle of Ontario somewhere, and I have to appeal to, in my mind, to not only the persons who can afford the $4,000 guitars, but also to the people who can afford the $200 or $300 guitars. So I've managed to get a great collection of $4,000 guitars and also a great collection of $200 guitars that appeal to everybody.
Nick's store, called the Guitar Boutique, is filled with a wide and varied range of guitars. Just don't go looking for Gibsons or Fenders.
One of the first guitars I owned was a Fender Jazzmaster, and it was a wonderful guitar, and I have nothing bad to say about Fender or Gibson. I owned a Gibson Les Paul in 1954, but the reason why you don't see it here is because every music store carries Gibson or Fender, and why bother have another store with Fenders and Gibsons when I can show you something different? You don't need to see a Fender here or a Gibson here. What you need to see, if you come to my store, is a guitar that you've never seen before.
Nick admits he pretty much loves all the guitars in the shop. They wouldn't be hanging on the walls otherwise. In fact, the store really started because of his large personal guitar collection.
I started collecting guitars several years back, and I got to the point where I had 50 of my own guitars, and I needed a place to put them because they were scattered all over in my warehouse. They were just piled up there, and I wanted to see them. Obviously, I couldn't play 50 guitars at one time, so I asked my son, who's a contractor, to build this room, and he started with one wall, and we put my guitars up. And I said, hey, that looks kind of good. Maybe we should keep going and maybe open a guitar store.
Indy from Britain, Rickenbacker from the US, and one of his all-time faves, Duesenberg from Germany.
I just love everything about Duesenberg. The fact that it's handmade in Germany, the fact that they make all the components that go into the guitars, the fact that they obviously put love into the guitars. Most of the manufacturers overseas don't put the love, they put the quantity. More guitars, the better, but Duesenberg don't have the quantity, they've got the love.
Duesenberg guitars began as parts guitars back in the 1970s. You could buy the body, the neck, the pickups, all the parts, and customize your own axe. By the mid-90s, Duesenberg was manufacturing their own guitars. By the early 2000s, they had established themselves in the guitar world with an endorsement from the Stones' Ron Wood, naming this Perloyd guitar after him. Still a small company, the total Duesenberg output is in the thousands instead of the hundreds of thousands.
It's evident by looking at them that they're beautiful guitars. If you played one, it's amazing to play, and one of my favorites is the fact that they have a vintage look to them. Although they're brand new, they look retro.
Hanging right next to the Duesenbergs, Nick has placed the Rickenbackers. Though in a strange departure for a guitar store, this one isn't for sale.
This is a Rickenbacker 325. This is the same guitar that John Lennon played in Montreal when I opened for them. This is his signature guitar that is probably one of 50 or 60 that were built, and I own it. I'm not overly interested in selling it, although I'm displaying it. It's not really for sale.
Yes, you heard it right. Nick Angelo's Four Frenchmen was the only Canadian group to open for the Beatles when they performed in Canada for the first time back in 1964, right at the beginning of Beatlemania.
John Lennon, my bass player Al, Ringo, which to me was a shock when he stood in front of me because of my height, which is not, I'm not 6 feet tall, but he was even shorter than me, which was interesting. I mean, it was my guitar player, Fred, Danny, my drummer. In the back here, I think we have George, who missed out on the opportunity to have his picture taken with me.
The four Frenchmen, Les Quatre Français, had become popular in Montreal playing covers of Four Seasons hits.
We were playing a variety of music. In those days, you know, cha-chas were in, just prior to the Beatles. After that, everything was out. There was cha-chas and there was mambos and samba. In Montreal, they sort of have a Latin flavor there, and they like their sort of Latin-type music. There was no shortage of work for our band. We were fortunate to meet a manager who picked us up and showed us the right ways to go, and he then booked us on as the opening act for the Beatles in 1964, which was one of the highlights of our career.
It was September 8th. This is exclusive footage of the Beatles taken by Nick's dad. No one at the time knew it, but there had been a death threat made against Ringo. He actually tried to position his cymbals on stage to protect himself from harm. And a bomb threat had been phoned into the Forum before the second show. Nick's father was an usher in the Forum, so he got amazing access that day. The first and last time the Beatles played Montreal.
They were on Ed Sullivan maybe a few weeks prior to that day, but they weren't the phenomenal Beatles that they turned out to be. They were obviously better than us. They had more acclaim than we did, but we didn't think that we were much less great than they were. It shows how wrong I was, thinking that we were almost as good as them. It's humbling to see how great they actually were.
Some younger people, like singer-composer Andrew Cole, are at first less than enthusiastic about the Fab Four.
Well, I grew up in Liverpool, England, and I had the Beatles rammed down my neck since I was a baby kid. I never had nursery rhymes. I had, you know, Let It Be and Abbey Road and all that played down my neck. So I'd watch like Lennon and George Harrison banging around on guitars, and I just always wanted one.
That didn't stop him from buying a Lennon signature guitar.
This is an absolutely mint 1969 Epiphone Casino, John Lennon edition, signed inside, and it's got a walnut back to it. And this is your classic revolver guitar, just absolutely gorgeous. This is my little gem. It's completely hollow. That's what makes it quite unique. All the casinos were all hollow. If you sat on that or pushed it in any way, it would just crumble like balsa wood. And it has the most unique, you know, sounds like something from a Beatles record the minute you plug it in.
But when you're going through hell, don't stop there, keep going.
For Carl Dixon, a rock guitarist who has performed with both April Wine and the Guess Who, his musical tastes and interests were formed and inspired by the Beatles.
To make this world better before your time's gone.
The Beatles were primary in generally turning me on to caring about music in such a deep way. There was a time when I was little that I thought every song on the radio was by the Beatles. I didn't know. I remember when I was 7 or 8 calling the local radio station in Sault Ste. Marie and requesting Aquarius by the Beatles. And they just laughed, you know. All those albums and bands and singles from that period of time, I was a nut for that stuff. I spent all my waking hours thinking about it and getting as many records as I could get my hands on. So the Beatles were huge.